Hello, everybody. Apologies for all the confusion there. I managed to do the standard leftist streamer thing and mess up, but we are here now on a slightly different stream, and we are joined by Palak Patel. Thanks so much for coming on, Palak.
Thank you for having me on.
So you actually sent me, I feel like half of my podcast stream conversations start this way, but you sent me your book, like a review copy of your book, right? The Tyranny of Nations. Right. 3 years ago? Maybe more. It was a while ago. And I did read it at the time. I don't think I was doing these conversations yet, but I think I said to you at the time, I was like, eventually we'll have a chat. I couldn't have predicted that eventually would be 2024, but here we are. At least we're here now.
That's all right. Yeah. You forced me to reread a book that I was always scared to go back and get again.
What you thought? Because you thought it would be, you'd read it and be like, oh God, this is terrible. What have I created?
Right.
I get that so much. Like, I'm actually writing a book at the moment, and I just feel, I'm just like, this could be the worst book that anyone's ever written. You know, like, you just get that feeling, don't you?
Yeah, I never even thought I would want to write a book. I was more mathematically inclined when I was younger, and I was not a good writer. I'm probably still not a good writer by any means, but
I wouldn't say that.
appropriate to this the title of this podcast. The American education system, and it seems like much of the Western education system, the objective is to funnel students into the corporate world. And so, I come from middle-class background. The lure of going into the financial world was quite strong. And this is around 2007 to 2011, the peak, I would say, of the asset management industry. Actually recently saw a chart that shows, I didn't work for a hedge fund, but it's in the asset. Those are just a subdomain in the asset management space, and you can see a chart of hedge fund bubble of openings that looks quite bubble-like, and the number of hedge fund openings peaked around 2011 and has shrunk considerably since. I actually don't think this is unrelated to sort of the problems the UK has encountered since that time. Peak finance around the years during the crisis and a few years afterwards, but that's a digression. But anyways, I unlearned a lot of myths, and I felt that it would be a shame if I didn't put what I unlearned on. On paper.
I mean, I'm glad you did, because I think it's really original, and in a lot of ways, there are themes that obviously people will have heard of, how dependent many countries are on investor sentiment, for instance, the role of the US as the global hegemon, and how economics is political, right? Those are three big themes that come out of your book, but also, the way you put them together, I think, is really, really valuable. And the subtitle is How the Last 500 Years Shaped Today's Global Economy. And I do feel that people often don't go that far back, right? I feel like they're sort of, usually when people do a broad analysis of like capitalism, they'll probably start with the Industrial Revolution, like maybe sort of 19th century, maybe 17th century, Adam Smith's time. But you go back and you talk about the Dutch as well, right? So, I mean, could you talk us through that comparison and why you think it's important?
Well, there's a question in social media that was, how much do you think about the Roman Empire? And in the US, we're prone to making historical analogies with antiquity more than England, the British Empire, which is much more proximate in history, and certainly more than the Dutch Republic. And I can't help but wonder if there's a reason for that, because there are many uncomfortable truths that even the cursory examination of these histories reveal. I think the main things that stood out to me is through initial readings of what was going on in the Dutch Republic. I'd always known that Amsterdam was a financial center. Obviously, more people know that London in the 19th century was the financial center. There's so many shared traits that taking a deeper dive revealed shared traits with the modern United States and global economy more broadly. Perhaps the thing that stood out the most was the internationalization of the currencies of each economic financial center. The Dutch Bill of Exchange was the sort of de facto global currency during the 17th century, and I can go into the reasons why. And I think I read that wrote that at the peak of its influence, the peak of the Victorian era, English bills of exchange, around 70% of international transactions were conducted in pound-based credit. And so that was just one shared aspect. But then unpeeling the onion, all three, obviously we know the US case, had an era of financialization, declining interest rates, rising asset prices, digging in further deeper. Each, the most relevant development in the US, the rise of sort of Trumpism, conversations around deindustrialization and outsourcing. I know those conversations happened in the UK as well. Well, there was outsourcing during the rise of the Dutch financial empire and British financial empires as well. And then lastly, all three sort of were politically decentralized as well, had relative tolerance compared to their peer countries. So I'm not going to frame that as a causal. I wouldn't say that these, often in history you sort of see a bit of back patting that we achieved greatness because we were more tolerant than the other countries. And I think that's a bit of a myth. At best, sort of decentralization is coincident rather than causal. And then lastly, there was a decline in domestic living standards for the local populations. In the U.S., we've seen life expectancy for certain segments of males decline. England often is flogged for being a declining empire and not what it once was. But the FT recently had an interesting graphic that showed that across income quartiles, Americans have a lower life expectancy. So even wealthy Americans have shorter lives than the English. So, and you saw these sort of similar degradation in living conditions in the Victorian era, where there was a lot of pollution because of industrial waste, more people abusing opiates, just like the U.S. today. And then during Dutch times, data is less abundant, but you see heights stagnating, evidence of malnutrition, so that was a sort of common grim shared element as well.
It's extremely striking, these long arcs of history between the Dutch, British, and American empires, and there's surprising things. So not just, I think it's fair to say the guiding centerpiece of your analysis, at least in terms of economics purely, is the low interest rates, right? Like they all enjoyed dominant financial sectors, very low borrowing rates. They had their fingers in a lot of pies across the globe. And one of the things I found quite amusing was that you went back and you note the Brits in maybe the 16th century complaining about the Dutch and how
That's correct.
They've got loads of, they can borrow whatever they want. We have to use their money, blah, blah, blah. And then you get about 100 or 200 years later, you get the Americans complaining about the Brits in exactly the same way, right? And now, of course, you've got people complaining about the Americans in the same way. You said you could go into why, to start from the bottom, why the Netherlands was dominant. Could you explain that a little bit more and how that worked?
So I want to preface that this is a lot of this is piecing together empirical evidence and speculation on my part. So I will my best speculate and speculation that others exploring. So I'm by no means the first, and I will tell you why I felt I had to write this book. Also, it's related to macroeconomic matter. What they were at the edge of the technological frontier. After the Dutch sort of, especially during, they weren't the people talk about Venice, for example, as sort of a financial center that preceded the Dutch, and some of the German cities as well. But the Dutch, by the late 16th century, when they run the 1560s, they declared independence from Catholic Spain. They were sort of moving to the forefront of shipping, of the forefront of land reclamation, of agriculture. And so they had moved to the technological frontier. And I view this as a sort of evolutionary process. Technology is not contained within a country, but sort of through exchange and interaction, dissipates to other fledgling nations, fledgling societies as well. In part of the book, what I describe is eventually a lot of the technological advances that the English made sort of could be traced back to things that were learned from Dutch merchants and skilled workers who came in to sort of establish enterprise in the UK during the Dutch period of globalization.
Yeah. And so how does it change? I suppose this is the question, right? Like how does it change? They go from this position of like outright dominance, and then they sort of get overtaken. I mean, you do emphasize military might, right? And I think this is one of your main points, and it's kind of obvious in a way. It's obvious. It's one of those things. It's obvious in a way. Anybody who looks at the history of the globe, I probably, when I was like 10, might have given you an answer that emphasized military might more versus after I'd like done an economics degree and learned to not to see all that kind of stuff, right? But I think you bring that back in as a really important determinant. I mean, would you say that was how it shifted?
I want to be careful here because there are a lot of people on the right, especially the far right, who are emphasize military prowess as the key to. Well, first of all, I just want to emphasize that I think this idea of hegemony, of priding oneself on their country's hegemony is silly. I mean, you would have to be an insane person to be in England today and say, "Oh, I prefer to live in the Victorian era where Britain was at its peak." I'm sure there are such people around, but the standard, the quality of living is so much better. But no, I'd say it's societal ossification. What does that mean? All of these countries, and as we see with the USA, turned into oligarchies. With a rise in inequality came inequality in power, and so sort of when you're at the top, there is sort of a tendency to entrench one's interests, and so the Dutch Republic, which was quite innovative in its time in being this decentralized a combination of provinces, succumbed to oligarchy, which was not unlinked to the extraordinary asset wealth, whether through interest in the Dutch East India Company and their ownership of those shares, or simply just the rents they collected on domestic enterprise or activities abroad. And so you have this sort of societal ossification. Going back to something you said, the decline in interest rates, I think these two things are not unrelated. Alongside this ossification was a decline in sort of investment vitality, investment opportunity. And so the desire to earn a safe return on interest rates on government debt became more compelling, bidding up the prices of these so-called safe government bonds. and leading to a decline in interest rates. This is sort of tied to, I don't know if you discussed this on prior episodes, the sort of the secular stagnation thesis.
Yeah. So it's an internal thing, really, right? As I guess you emphasize like the rise in inequality that a lot of these, well, all three of these empires. Sorry, there's a helicopter outside, and I wonder if people can hear it. It's really loud for me anyway. But you emphasize the God, that is so distracting. The what was I saying? The helicopter's throwing me off completely. The internal dynamics, the rise in inequality, right? And you show that there was like a massive rise in inequality in all of these instances, and like a rise in rent seeking that you talk about. I mean, I suppose, and I hope you don't feel like you've already answered this, but like, how could you go into more detail on how that happens? Because is there not an oligarch class throughout, right? I mean, I would say early Britain in the Industrial Revolution has an oligarch class, right? And early Netherlands does, and early America clearly does as well, right? So what kind of changes with them? Do they become
So that's interesting that you ask that. So it's a process of institutional change. I think and that's sort of where I wanted to center this history, is that when you look at the these, I mentioned that the Dutch had made a considerable advance in their governance. Well, what was that advance? The other states at the time were monarchies, or monarchical, and feudal. And so in the Dutch case, they started out with sort of a quasi-regent called the stadtholder, and by the apex of their financial empire, they actually left that seat vacant, and so had almost become fully what's called fully a republic. And so the other thing is that this is cyclical. I think that in the case of the sort of inequality is a global phenomenon as well. I mean, I think in your Piketty discussion, It doesn't just happen in these countries. But what's significant is this happening in these centers and forcing decline in these centers. And from that decline, all other sort of ramifications for other countries percolate.
Yeah. So I want to actually, there is a little tidbit that I wanted to ask you about, because I'm really curious about this. So you do the last 500 years, right? Dutch, British, American empires, and you mentioned them earlier. But what do you reckon to how far back this goes? I mean, could you have done the last 1,000 years and put more on the Venetians, or I don't know, even Islamic empires before that, or something like that? Or do you see these cycles as starting 500 years ago? Like, what's the crucial difference here, or is it just a choice that you made?
It's just on availability of data. The data is not so good, but I'll tell you something. So I described this cycle of cooperation and conflict in the book, and the conflict element is so. What was the conflict element? The war between the Dutch Republic and Catholic Spain. Subsequently, the war between Britain and Napoleonic France, and then last, in the most recent case, the war between sort of the United States and the Soviet Union. And from after those periods, when sort of those wars, and you get to this period of globalization cooperation. After I wrote my book, I came across the introduction to Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, and at the end of his introduction, he talks about this cycle of sort of anarchy and order that goes back to, he dates back to 200 BC, and then it permeates philosophies and different philosophies that have evolved since then. And he talks about this tension between societal, the desire for individualism in society, which we often associate with these liberal eras, and the desire with order, which we associate with the disappointment of those eras. And so I'm sure it goes far back, but in the absence of data, it's just hard to explore those other periods.
Yeah, and like we said, right, the centerpiece or the starting point for your analysis is this analysis of interest rates, right? So if you don't have that data, then it's kind of difficult for you to draw an analogy. I mean, it's fair enough. I was just curious, really, because I suppose another question is about capitalism, right? And people in chat are already, for some reason, talking about Marx and capital, which isn't the topic, chat. But let's join them a little bit and talk about capitalism, because I guess if you ask 10 economists to define capitalism, you get 10 different definitions, maybe more. But do you see the Dutch empire as capitalist? And if so, then why is that? Like, what is your definition of capitalism?
I don't have one. I might irritate some of your commenters in saying that I actually have I find this term a bit abrasive and sort of unhelpful. And I'll tell you why. There is a fallacy. I don't know if you've discussed the capital fallacy. It's this post-Keynesian idea. So Marx shares a lot of assumptions with the classical school. And the biggest assumption is this idea of aggregate capital. And I think this is where prior histories of this Dutch financial empire, these English financial empires, they've made these sort of classical assumptions that the interest rates in these economies declined because they had an abundance of capital. And to me, this is deleterious because especially in modern times, if you look at currencies, for instance, the prevailing paradigm of the IMF and the World Bank is that capital flows across borders. And Joan Robinson critique, what does that mean? Does that reflect reality? Well, the Bank of International Settlements has shown that currency turnover is 20 times the amount of the amount of transactions that are typically conducted in trade. And the only way you can explain this is that speculation, financial activity, is what is driving the movements of currencies. Now, going back to this idea of aggregate capital, this goes to the Cambridge capital controversy, and these post-Keynesian economists, many showed that you can point to individual instances of capital, plant capital, equipment, but you cannot, for various complicated reasons, aggregate these. And sort of in the Marxist paradigm, sort of it's still, I think there's some post-Keynesian Marxists, notably Michael Koletsky, who was sort of whose work diverged from here. But I guess I don't know, and I can see a future where that term loses relevance. I know that will irritate a lot of people.
No, it's good. I completely see where you're coming from. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself a Marxist really, but I completely see where you're coming from. And I guess your emphasis, as you just said, is on financial. And I guess with financial capital, if you want to call it that, then you have an obvious coherence, right? Because you can look at nominal money flows, right, and investment. And that's, to me, the essence of a kind of post-Keynesian approach. But you're about to stop me.
Well, actually, yes, because I'm going to stop because you used the word flow. Actually, even that I think trips us up on how we think about international exchange.
Okay.
So Daniela Gabor, we had earlier, has done fantastic work on this. And if you go back and look at some of her lectures, she shows how international money is created. It doesn't flow because a U.S. investor, carries shipments of dollars across. And even more than that, a UK bank and a Spanish bank can create dollars. So all that has to happen is that a corresponding, you look at a T account on the deposit side and on the asset side, one bank credits their holders with dollar-denominated deposits. So a UK bank can create dollars, as can a Spanish bank. What ends up happening is that in the end, can they meet these dollar deposit liabilities? And that's where crises happens. But this idea of flow, I think itself trips us up in how we think about international exchange.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you mean, like stock flow confusion? Is that what you're talking about, or is it something a bit more subtle than that?
I think it's a bit more subtle. So, for instance, if say Sainsbury wanted to borrow in dollars, they could do so from one of the Spanish banks, BBVA. There's no American entity involved there. It could be the case that the Spanish banks have depositors amongst the American banks, but that consideration isn't even relevant here. All that needs to occur is that BBVA is branch in the UK deposits whatever amount of dollars that Sainsbury is seeking to borrow.
And why isn't it helpful to think about that as a flow? It's not helpful to think about that as a flow. Is that your point?
Yes, because when we start talking about flows, then you start getting into the issue of current accounts and trade balances. And I think that this is sort of, maybe in a simpler way, what I could say is the movements of currencies today happen in a fashion that cannot be explained by balance of trade.
So you often hear these expressions like, they'll say there's all this money sloshing around the global economy. People always say that, don't they? It really annoys me for some reason. Maybe I've just heard it too many times. But what you're saying is that's not really it. What's happening is that the dollar is so dominant that it gets created and destroyed across the globe, even in the absence of American institutions. And thinking about that as a flow doesn't really make sense because it's a creation, right? Is that, am I getting
that's correct?
What you're saying?
No, that's correct. Okay. And then you get into these discussions about China dumping dollars from its trade surpluses, export surpluses, and then even back to the 70s of petrodollar recycling. And to me, that's all nonsense when looking at the data. And it's not just me saying this. I think more orthodox economists have come out and sort of questioned this notion as well.
I think we're touching on something that's really key about how this all works, because I think it's, we all talk about Britain. The sun never sets on the British Empire, and Britain was clearly the dominant global economy, and now the USA is, right? And people talk about dollar dominance, but you actually gave an example which stuck with me. And the first time I read it, I remembered it. I was like, and then when I revisited it, I was like, oh yeah, it's a really good example. So you don't use the US or Britain or the Netherlands, you use South Africa. So to understand how this dominance of a currency emerges, which is what you're talking about, right, with this flow confusion, you use the South African common currency area. So could you explain that to the uninitiated, which included me?
I use that example. So Lesotho is landlocked within South Africa, and it uses its banks. It's pegged. Its currency is pegged. I forget actually, is pegged or even outright uses the South African rand, which is interesting to me because the South African rand, certainly at least in the Western world, and I see to most people, is kind of known as is sort of considered a shit currency. It's notoriously volatile, and anyone, let's say, so if someone bequeathed you a fortune in South African rand, you would probably within the hour try to convert it into pound or dollars. Right. And so that's why I use that example. Nevertheless, Lesotho uses the South African rand, and so you sort of have the sub hierarchy within the dollar system. With the point being that the dollar still forms the backbone of the global monetary system.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you could say one counter argument you address, right, is people might think, well, that's the reason that the countries around South Africa use their currency is because they're relatively poorer than South Africa. But that's not even it, is it? It's that the financial institutions, the banks of South Africa, have basically their tendrils into these countries, right? So so many transactions take place using what was the name of the South African currency? I forgot it. It was
the rand.
The rand, yeah, right. Yeah. And they use the rand, right? And that creates this dominance of South Africa within that small area, despite the fact that, like you said, the rand isn't even a particularly stable currency. So yeah, and that's like what's happening writ large across the global economy, as with your example of the Spanish bank, right? The dollar is just used by everyone. It doesn't necessarily involve the US. It doesn't necessarily involve a US bank directly or the US government. The only way that it involves the US is that it's the dollar that's being used. But I mean, I guess that might have expanded even probably. I don't know when the Fed extended its swap lines exactly.
Yeah,
that was probably as the book was coming out, or maybe just before.
Well, actually, it goes back to the 2008 crisis, where it was what makes the dollar different, and it's that in episodes of financial panic, there's a flight to the U.S. dollar. Keynes calls this the elasticity of substitution with what makes money different than any other asset or object, and it's that it has a low elasticity of substitution. It's that you are less likely to switch out of that asset into another asset. And so during times of panic, because of the position the United States has, there you see what's called a bid for dollars. And so what happened in 2008 was that currencies all over the world, even in more developed countries, became illiquid, and so they were in want of supply they sort of needed these Fed swap lines to access dollars. And a swap, by the way, is a derivative, so it's created out of thin air as well. So it's not like the Fed was sort of sending dollars on planes to South Korea and Japan and the ECB.
Yeah. They created these swap lines in 2008 or 2009 maybe, and it was they in 2020 though they expanded them. Maybe it was 2021 to include. I think maybe South Korea was among the ones that got expanded to, and Brazil, Mexico. I think just a lot more countries. Now, still not every country. I don't know if South Africa's in that group if it gets dollars, but it's sort of gradually expanded, and it just seems like.
It depends on who's your friend in global politics.
Yeah, that's it. Right. Well, this is a perfect segue, right? Because like one of your main points in this book is quite how political the economy is, and I think it's again, like I said at the start, right? It's a familiar argument, but when you look at global hegemons and military power and things like this, like the Fed extending its swap lines, you realize, no, it really is just politics all the way down.
I would say politics and institutions.
Okay.
I think, and I do a disservice to the concept of institutions because a lot of things have changed. One critique I got of the book is that I'm treating sort of time as a flat circle, borrow a phrase from True Detective. But I'm not, I didn't intend to do that. Now we live in a world where that people today have many more freedoms than they did even during Dutch times. So, the most telling example is the abolition of slavery as an institutional change.
Yeah.
So I would say it's not just politics in the sense that there's something more grounded in the human experience. It's the best way I can put it without and I'd say when you and just to tie in something to the dollar conversation, this dominance of the dollar is an emergent phenomenon. It is not. Some people say, well, we should all just stop using the dollar because of the bellicosity the American have inflicted upon the rest of the world. It's not so simple. It's not so simple as just saying we're going to decide to use the RMB or the euro or some other currency and abandon the dollar. And so it is tied to these institutional political elements.
I mean, you do at one point you do talk about like something maybe more in line with what Keynes originally proposed, because he wanted the Bancor, right, as the global reserve currency instead of the US dollar. And I don't think you call for the Bancor, but you do say that the IMF could have some kind of reserve facilities that are probably connected to the dollar, but like kind of separate from it to take away, a little bit of power from the USA. Is that something that you sort of would like to see?
It's not. It is. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'll tell you what I find so ironic, and what so few people point out in sort of the inflation hysteria of the past few years, is that the Fed printed a lot of money. There's an abundance of dollars. If there's an abundance of dollars, then why have so many more countries gone into default in the last 4 or 5 years? We're looking. Sri Lanka has defaulted for the first time in its country. Lebanon defaulted. Pakistan is on the brink of default, which would be one of the most dangerous developments. A nuclear power defaulting. And I laugh uncomfortably, but and Argentina defaulted. So countries, there's so many countries starving of dollars to simply pay back their debts, and so that sort of ties into the context of aggregate demand, where this view that the IMF has is that the way international economics works is that some countries are more developed, others are less developed. Those more developed countries, if the less developed countries put in the right policies, make the right sacrifices, and sing the right paeans to the confidence fairies, they will get their turn. They will acquire an abundance of dollars, which they can invest into their economy and also become developed. And that is especially nonsensical to me in a world in which the tendency of policymakers is to impose austerity with any political capital that they have, to use it on implementing austerity. And so that's where I think the most basic thing is, if we want to stop sort of this political radicalism, largely on the right, in my opinion, you have to start with the most basic thing. It's that let's try to prevent the spate of defaults that we've been seeing over the last decade.
You read that book? I think it's Clara Mattei. Is it How Austerity Paved the Way for Fascism? It came out since your book, I think.
I have not read it, but I buy it. I mean, if you look at go on.
No, I wasn't going to say anything. Carry on.
In Argentina, it's a country I'm very familiar with. I used to work for the second largest bondholder of Argentinian securities, and both the investors and IMF took a sort of delusional attitude towards the country, and what are we left with? We're left with this sort of. You did a video on this, this really frightening individual in charge there.
That video is quite funny. It's like a 3-hour stream of me reading his paper. The only paper he has written in English, or it's a book chapter, but it's really nonsensical.
Well, the funny thing is he has a falling out with the IMF right now, and one of my friends was like, "Well, isn't he doing everything, implementing all the policies that the IMF wants to implement?" And it turns out that the IMF is actually pushing back. It sort of doesn't like the cuts he's making to social spending. So it's trying to have its cake and eat it too. But
that's a strange place to be in when the IMF's telling you to do more social spending. That's not historically precedented, really.
That's right. Yeah. But he's they say scratch a libertarian, a fascist bleeds.
Yeah,
I've read it, and so he has no. He's ideologically his ideological agenda is to gut whatever is left of the social state there.
Well, he tried to ban street protests, didn't he? I think he failed, but he immediately tried to ban them because that's what I mean. Yeah. Again, actually, to be clear, I don't know if I said this. I haven't read Clara Matteo's book, but like you, it's like as soon as I hear the title, and I will read it and hopefully interview her. But as soon as I read the title, I buy it, right? Because it's like, yeah, as soon as you cut these things that are how people are meeting their needs, especially in Argentina, somewhere with a lot of poverty, basic stuff like food, cutting pensions, firing people, then they're gonna rebel, they're gonna protest. So how do you deal with that politically? You have to put them down. So that's just like, austerity and at least authoritarianism, let's say, can go hand in hand.
And the main reason is because development under current global institutional arrangements is impossible for peripheral countries. So in Ukraine, for example, there's this idea that Ukraine can become the next Poland. Look at the success of the Polish countries. Look at the success of the Czech Republic. Look at the success of Hungary. And that success is historically dependent. That is a totally different global demand environment, first of all, that those economies operated in. Never mind their even closer proximity to Germany when it was outsourcing its own manufacturing and sort of trying to move towards cheaper labor. You simply just cannot repeat that. And so a country like Ukraine, to borrow a phrase from the economist Thorstein Veblen, who first assailed the idea of capital, is stuck between the devil and the deep sea. It has to choose the IMF, or it has to, even more frighteningly, I suppose, submit to the imperial aggrandizement of Russia. What they're under current institutions, there is no middle path. And this too starkly repeats history. I don't know if you've come across the book Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. There's an interesting quote in this book, and it's that in the orthodox economics, Great Britain was just another atom in the universe of trade. So when you establish global institutions on the premise that the U.S. is just like every other economy, which is evolved, but still too proximate to the thinking of the 19th century, where Britain was no different. Its economy obeyed the same laws and rules as any other economy. That is where you start going down an uncomfortable political slope.
Yeah, I mean this notion, and I discussed this with Ingrid Kavangaran as well, like just the global context and who's the global hegemon is, where you are geographically. All these things clearly matter for whether or not you develop, whereas arguably a lot of explanations that you find in economics, both kind of loosely left and right explanations, focus too much on domestic policy, right? So you've got people who are pro-industrial policy who might point to South Korea, and then you've got people who are anti-industrial policy who think that laissez-faire is better, and I don't know, maybe they'll point to Hong Kong or something. But like actually in every single case, these policies, whether these policies succeed, seems to depend on the relationship with the bigger powers.
That's correct. I mean, in the case of, every single of these industrial currencies. Let's put China aside because that's a different.
Okay.
Free China were allies in the Cold War. Singapore had a British military base there. South Korea's a bulwark against North Korea. Japan, people forget Shinzo Abe's family came from the people who promulgated fascism in that country. Who was brought back to power.
Yeah.
And the same is true for West Germany as well. And so, so these countries were bulwarks in the anti-communist battle. This author Clinton Fernandez calls them sub-imperial powers. It's what they grew to become. And even like a country like Brazil, you use the term Brazilianization. The Brazilian military was worked in concert with Western, sort of policy strategists to prevent sort of the left-wing tide there as well. And so Economists can't talk about this, though. It's certainly not orthodox economists, because they're they're highly politically charged realities.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's the sort of I think in the back of mainstream economists' minds, and they deny this, but they've got the comparative advantage grid. You know, Portugal produces wine, England produces cloth. How do they optimize their production? They pursue their comparative advantage, and then everyone ends up with more. But it's kind of a neat little exercise, I guess, but like when you actually read a book like yours, and you've got everything that's actually happening, including this dominance, including the military stuff, the technological stuff, is basically useless as a guide to real world trade, I think.
Yeah, and what's ignored in the wine example, for instance, is, well, where's the what is the behavior of finance in that example? How much debt are these Portuguese wine producers or even Portuguese citizens incurring to buy British goods, or to engage in these transactions? And all that is sort of swept aside. Uh, it's and I think what really sort of also, but you'd be surprised by even how much this sort of thinking, the line seems to be, a lot of progress has occurred on economic thinking, but I don't think it's a coincidence that sort of the line of that progress is often drawn in international economics, because that's where you start to get into the realm of foreign policy and where things start to get inconvenient. I think we had a conversation about this, but there's this book, Trade Wars or Class Wars, by Pettis and Klein. Two individuals who are, in my opinion, quite, they sort of, there's a fun debate they had with Daniela Gabor and some post Keynesians. And sort of, they have this notion that America is being imperialized by China. And it was this, the title of the book was sort of a gimmick, a red herring to get, a lot of people in. But what they're saying is that, China's current account surplus is causing low interest rates in the U.S., and this is sort of a new type of imperialism. I just think that's total rubbish, because it ignores what's going on financially across the globe. And financially across the globe, the U.S. investors and Chinese investors too, because I think a lot of developing economies, namely Venezuela, Ecuador, and these oil for finance deals, owe loans to these to U.S. investors and Chinese state-owned banks to a lesser extent. And the creation of these loans has nothing to do with trade balance deficits or surpluses.
Yeah. It's funny. It always strikes me the yellow fever in the USA is really noticeable for somebody who is just not in the USA, right? Anyone from outside the country can see it, and it's really I actually had heard of that book, but I hadn't read it. I didn't realize that its main point was that sort of China is imperializing. I mean, do you see? This was kind of the inevitable China question that I wanted to ask you at some point, so I might as well ask it now.
Sure.
Do you see them imperialism or no? Do you see them becoming the next one in the cycle? Do you think that that's what's going to happen over the next 100 years, say?
I don't. I mean, I think the best development for the world if there is no hegemon in the next cycle, because I'm not sure the world, given first the climate disaster and then second the threat of nuclear conflict. I just don't think that this sort of cycle can or should repeat itself. Yeah. And so if in an ideal circumstances, first of all, there should be no hegemon, but secondly, I think with China, they have followed a pattern. So let's talk. I think that was also quite revealing to me. They, to me, and I sort of try to make this case, have followed the pattern of Imperial Germany, and before that, France under Louis XIV, Bourbon France, where they first initially were suspect of market organization out of convenience, for the sake of development. entered into this era of cooperation, but by no means find themselves tethered to it, or dependent upon it. So I think that yes, China has market institutions. It adopted market institutions after Deng Xiaoping, but I do not think that. I think there's sort of a contradiction. The idea that China is going to carry forth global market institutions is a bit contradictory, because I don't think that their political economy has any fealty to markets and institutions.
So to put it perhaps slightly glibly, they're kind of going to do their own thing and focus on their own industrialization. You think they'll just sort of, like France and Germany before them, and South Korea, I guess, in a way, and Japan, sort of join the ranks of the richer countries, but not necessarily pursue this global hegemon position?
It's already not becoming their path. They are becoming more and more closed. They are closing their capital account, their financial accounts. They're stopping money from entering and leaving the country, because they themselves have had this massive experience with inequality and corruption. And so I think I read something like the amount of dollar liabilities in the Chinese banking system is like $70 trillion or something like that, compared to their reserves of, like, I don't know what the latest figure is, but it's much smaller than that. And so they can't have all these asset holders of dollar denominated assets converting to dollars. And so that makes it quite difficult to sort of assume this mantle of financial power. And then relatedly, this started happening when Xi Jinping sort of was cracking down on the tech giants, Alibaba there, where you'd see US commentators, going back to what your comment with the LP, were saying, China is doomed because, or can't develop anymore because they're eschewing market institutions. There's no rule of law or safety for asset holders. Like, they don't need that. They don't need market institutions to produce electric vehicles. They don't need market institutions. In fact, part of the reason that they're sort of progressing ahead of the US on clean energy and electric vehicles is because they're not hostage to market institutions. Nevertheless, that country has its own share of problems when it comes to the institutional ideas. I mean, there's no, it has its own brand of right politics, which I don't want to get into. But I'm just going back to the idea of what I find contradictory in this idea that the RMB is going to displace the dollar and markets will be under Chinese agency.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I wasn't really sure. I don't know. Lots of people always ask me about China. I feel like it's one of the number one things I get asked about, and I don't feel like I know that much about it. But it's interesting to know that they're not pursuing this kind of hegemonic route. I mean, or at least it seems that way. I do want to ask you something. I almost want to go back, because we've been discussing your analysis, and there's something which you actually say very early on, which I think is just worth repeating on stream for everybody, because I think it really succinctly grapples with what you're trying to get at throughout the book. And this is the triple coincidence, right? The triple coincidence of economic, political, and geographic boundaries of a country all being the same. And I think even once you say that out loud, you're like, oh yeah, of course they're not, right? But could you explain this? Because I feel like it really it's central to your analysis, right?
Yeah, I mean, the assumption that many economists and commentators still make is that these countries are just atomic units, and that the sphere of America's financial influence, not just America, I gave the South Africa example of that the sphere of and forget even economic influence, of political influence is confined within borders. You can view, there are good, strong cases that one can make. I'm trying to sort of stop myself from going into territory. I'm trying to keep it to economics, but it's really hard not to. But it is. I really don't mean to be offensive, but the joke is that England, the UK, isn't the 51st state; it's the 52nd state of the United States. Right? So, is that in itself sort of?
Yeah.
I'm trying to be very careful here with what I say,
Fine.
but
we don't mind a bit of Brit hate on this channel.
I mean, I like England, so despite being someone whose ancestors came from India,
Yeah.
but I think this is just outrageous. You would be surprised. It's right when you say something like that out loud. You're like, this can't be true, but that's how a lot of financial discourse is in economic discourse is still conducted. And we've just recently we saw this with the inflation scare. This stimulus for this once in a century pandemic was too much. I mean, how can it? We're talking about an existential crisis. We're just counting beans. There'll be nobody left alive to count beans. That's just the pandemic, not even climate. And so the U.S. will turn into Argentina because the same laws of economics apply to the U.S. that apply to Argentina. It's utter nonsense.
You've got even something as basic as organizations like the G7, the EU, and the UN, right? You've got these sort of international organizations. You've got the US has military bases. You've got other political influences, cultural similarities as well. I mean, the Donald Trump inspired Bolsonaro, right? And Millet as well, right? So there's so many things. Some of them are obvious. Some of them
England. Yeah, and I say England has its own version of Trump in the 19th century, Benjamin Disraeli,
right?
And that's linked to another aspect that we haven't discussed is the transformation of a country. So each of these countries had their own. They started off as peripheries, then they sort of followed these protectionist, mercantilist. Tariff-based models, and then once they reached the frontier, it became convenient with them for these countries. They saw the opportunity to spread their economic influence beyond just their borders, start embracing free trade. But with each of those epochs, there are coalitions involved and linked there. So Trump sort of, he makes a fuss about tariffs, and the legacy of the Republican Party in the United States is that it was the protectionist party, and so that sort of is where I draw those analogies from. What were the links of each of these parties to the broader national economic agenda?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as well. Can we talk a little bit actually about your history, because you've mentioned this a couple of times, but I didn't get a chance to ask you, because you sort of sarcastically refer to yourself as a bond vigilante in a past life, right? And this is where your analysis has come from, right? It's come from a lot of experience, and especially in you say South Asia and Latin America, right? Poorer countries, what's sometimes called emerging markets. And so you've kind of seen this financial influence that you're talking about play out, right? So is that, how did that sort of motivate you to write this book?
So I, perhaps like you, sort of entered the real world, sort of had coming of age. I guess I don't know. After sort of around the financial crisis, a little bit afterwards, and austerity to me was quite shocking. The fact that we had, I know you asked Joe Mitchell this, I mean, that this sort of era of austerity came about right after the financial crisis. And I had the naive opinion that this happened because we sort of had these technical misunderstandings about economics worked. I was a big fan of Paul Krugman, and it was, thinking was, well, if we just had the right people in power, and if they just understood how macroeconomics really worked, we wouldn't have austerity. We would realize that this bout of high CPI, high harmonic inflation in Europe right after the financial crisis was sort of a statistical quirk. In Britain, what happened, for example, was there was a spike in inflation after the stimulus measures to avert a deeper crisis, and that's where part of the initiative, austerity, seemed to come from. But I had a disillusionment. This disillusionment came during 2016, where I saw Hillary Clinton go up in the primaries and say, "Well, we need to right size our debt. Our debt is getting out of control." And that's where I realized, oh no, this is just ideology. This is just austerity has always been there. It's not just new it's not just a new development in the 2010s. It has been the ideology since the sort of decline, sort of after the end of the Cold War, and as it was the ideology for the British Liberals, and before them the Dutch Staatsparty that came into power after once they finally achieved unquestioned hegemony.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus, sorry. Okay, so I want to let's go back to this triple coincidence, right? Because I want to talk about what you want to do, what your proposals are. Now, we mentioned one about like reserve currencies and stuff, but I think your main point in the book, I think, is to call for more cooperation, right? I think that's the main word that comes up a lot, and whether that's internationally or within countries as well. You want there to be more cooperation, and that's why you said what you said earlier about you hope there isn't a new global hegemon in the 21st and the 22nd centuries, right? So could you talk us through like what this looks like in practice and what kind of institutions you'd like to see set up?
I think we, at minimum, this is a difficult question because this is where we get into the realm of what many, I guess, would call technocracy.
Yeah.
To me, that's part of the problem. To me, the problem of why we have so much sort of anger and sort of proto-fascist or fascist-like activity is this sort of anger that comes from changes, of adverse changes, sort of people more detached from these situations have experienced, and things that are out of their control. And technocracy is inherently anti-democratic. So I want to be careful of saying this one solution will solve your problems. And I think this is part of the problem with the economics profession, is that politics is they're at the behest of politicians. There's only political constraints are severe and binding. And so, that said, the assumptions around the current setup of multilateral institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are all based on this idea of equilibrium, that there is a current account equilibrium, there is a balance of trade equilibrium, there's a real interest rate equilibrium. There are all this nonsensical, quasi-religious modeling in macroeconomics is based on the idea of equilibrium. I think there needs to be an admittance first that disequilibrium is a real phenomenon, and it turns out actually that when the IMF and World Bank were being set up, that there were disagreements even amongst the Keynesian camp. I mentioned Michael Kalecki. Michael Kalecki and E.F. Schumacher had their own disagreements with Keynes and White, and the main disagreement was related to disequilibrium, in that Keynes and White wanted to assume equilibrium because it was politically convenient to do so. To disagree would be sort of to butt heads with the political powers that be. And so I think we first need to go back to admitting that reality, and that's linked to this idea. Well, if you believe in disequilibrium, then you have to admit that there are peripheral countries. They do not adhere. They do not have the same flexible, let's say, laws of economics that the U.S. might benefit from. And there needs to be more leeway for these economies, especially if you want to prevent more adverse political developments. And to put an optimistic spin, I mentioned the Argentina example. The IMF has shown concern with social spending for a reason, because lost a lot of its credibility in the 90s and became associated with being a boogeyman that brought down societal harm by gutting the welfare state. And they sort of want to backtrack on this, on these policies from the 90s that sort of got them this bad reputation. And so I think they see this need too of sort of being less dogmatic about these ideas of how international development works. But it still needs to go much farther. I don't have a good answer.
I mean, it's an extremely complex question. I suppose I just wanted to know more the vibe, right, of what you'd like to see, right, which you've given me, which is like, I wonder with the IMF, can it reform?
The bigger problem?
Do we abolish it?
Well, so the bigger problem to me is going across history is, how do we get a fiscal state? How do we get a bigger welfare state outside the context of war? Because I don't think it's a coincidence. I show the fiscal spending of the Dutch Republic. I show the sort of, if you look at the deficit or estimations of the fiscal deficit in Britain, they're at their apex during these big conflicts. The Dutch with the Spanish and with Catholic Spain, and the British with the Napoleonic Empire. And so, can you get a welfare state that comes out of around the world, that comes out of democratic initiative, as opposed to elite fear of more radical or violently radical, in their perspective, of egalitarian tendencies, and because so far we don't have a good history of that.
I was about to ask, I mean, how many examples of that are there historically? I don't know. I mean, Scandinavia is the one, Nordic countries that people often point to. But are you going to tell me there's a military context to that as well?
Well, so the Scandinavian countries are more proximate to Russia, right? I mean, I don't know. I think, and even those countries, I mean, they're like, if you look at Ericsson, some of the tech companies, the legacy tech companies in the Scandinavian countries, I mean, their technological know-how came from military R&D research. So I think that you can't. I don't think it says. I don't know. I don't know how much I buy those examples of countries.
But I suppose there's like a conservative part of me that's saying this sounds impossible. It's like I don't know. Is it a sort of depressing reality that this is long been the way of the world?
No, because I think that this is all knowledge that we have. You know, it's nobody. We're talking about. I mean, even the current discourse. There has, like I said, there's been significant institutional change, and you can now go on YouTube and say things that you would have been executed for saying 400 or 500 years ago, right? So, and I think there's a collective. The world has grown in terms of people, but has shrunk in terms of I know these big tech companies that sort of try to gate interaction, and countries are banning social media as well, but there is a lot more exchange of information across the globe, and I think there is diminished appetite. And at the peak of globalization, you have this idea of BRICS, right? Historically, peripheral countries that sort of wanted to take the lead. And I think there is this idea of collective historical knowledge that, to be optimistic, perhaps we shouldn't perpetuate on the rest of the world. That's my optimistic spin.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I am. Yeah, no. Thanks for providing an optimistic take. I am kind of optimistic, right? And I do. I will continue to bang this very drum. But I guess I just. I just feel like even after World War II, right? You've got Bretton Woods and John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White in the USA, and that was a time where after a very horrible war and the Depression as well, and World War One before that, people were really looking to cooperate. And even that, even that ended up being shaped in the interests of the hegemon, right? That's the kind of thing that bothers me. I'm just, I don't know, I get a little bit doomer about it.
I think historically the Labour Party, though, did push back on U.S. initiatives. I mean, there's only so much, I think, in the wake of something like Cold War, and I mean, if you just look at Britain, it's such a different country. Something like the NHS was so unthinkable 100 years before. I mean, this is let's ignore what austerity has done to that institution, but we're talking about the country that was the most ideological about classical economics, developing arguably the best healthcare system in the world. If something like that can happen, who knows where what could lie in the future with when there is more awareness of the current state and what's the sort of policies of the past.
I didn't go into this conversation looking to be a doomer, but since we're on the subject of the UK, I mean, what do you make of the Liz Truss government, right? Because that was about a year after the book came out. And I've seen a lot of people, and from Keir Starmer himself, our glorious prime minister, to like left-wing academics, say this proves that the UK's now is getting closer to Argentina in a way than to the US, and like you actually can't spend money and you can't do progressive reform because of the markets. I mean, do you think that that's the case?
I have a question for you that I want to link back to this. So it's sort of related to that. I was looking. I think part of the problem is that it is so inflation. The way we discuss it is sort of a category error. First of all, the idea of a 2% inflation target in the U.S. is completely arbitrary. Why? There's no evidence that that inflation can accelerate at 4%. It's really funny because Olivier Blanchard, suggested a 4% inflation target 10 years ago. The problem for so part of this comes from a lot of this discourse of we have inflation in the UK, it's quite off target, but because someone made an arbitrary threshold for where inflation accelerates versus where it doesn't. I do think, however, that a real constraint that the UK does face is that there is a dependency on American finance that I don't think can be denied. So there needs to be a mutual adjustment. I mean, there sort of needs to be sort of a collective rethinking. I think if the UK unilaterally said we can I think it's hard for the UK to do stimulus absent in an environment where the US is so ideological about fiscal rigidity. I hope that kind of answers that question.
I mean, do you think that the push for global change of the type you'd like to see, do you think it probably has to come from the US or majorly come from the US for that reason? Because surely the UK is not the only country where that's true, right? A lot of countries depend on American finance. That's like one of the central points that you're making, right? So do you think that like the political shift would have to come from there, and would it be like curtailing investment, curtailing markets and like designing more restricted forms of finance and bonds and stuff like that? Or I'm just curious, really.
I think the good news is I think ideology in the US and UK sort of evolves together. So yeah, I'm trying to be optimistic. It's hard to see, or it's very likely that a world in which there's progress in terms of UK political economy, that there's corresponding matching progress that has occurred in the US. Um, sort of, um, uh, so absent that, I think what would probably see, the thing is, let's go back to what happened during the pension crisis with during the Truss government. It's that if you're a U.S. hedge fund or if you're a UK hedge fund, which is basically has prime brokers and lending counterparties, they borrow money from U.S. based institutions, effectively the same thing. Um, they can take massive speculations against the pound. The pound is more is sort of because it's not the backbone of global finance. It is more vulnerable to these speculative sort of selling activity from U.S. based investors or even UK hedge funds whose backers are U.S. Banking or bigger banking financial institutions. And so, if tomorrow you had a UK government that said, we're going to restrict speculation from the US, something you could, ahead of that, have a giant depreciation of the pound. Then that becomes a question of political economy. So it's like, would the UK polity be comfortable with sort of divorcing itself from a more austere it's more austere elder brother charitably. I don't know. It's just we get into the realm of politics. I mean, look at the influence that Rupert Murdoch has in the UK, right? Like we're talking about the realm of like, what would the media be saying, right? I mean, it's always convenient with someone from being someone with left-wing inclinations that well, if we just show the ordinary person the common, the right, what's actually going on, reveal that the truth, that they will come to our side. It's easy to say when in reality they're being brainwashed on a daily basis by corporate media. So I think you'd have to have some sort of.
I mean, it becomes quite ethereal.
Yeah, but I think you would have to have a sort of mutual progress. You'd have to sort of have a dual progress on thinking in both the U.S. and this goes back to the idea of what you mentioned, the IMF, is that absent, the U.S. has to create conducive demand conditions for other countries to produce demand stimulus. It's a collective action problem of sorts. If every country does fiscal stimulus in absence of the U.S. doing fiscal stimulus, that is a losing battle.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's a relative thing, right? So if you're all doing it, then there's not necessarily that much room for as much room for investor panic, right? Is that what you're getting at?
That's correct. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, I don't want to be too much of a doomer. I'm just curious, and it's obviously, I think it's difficult when you're fighting such big systems and people and institutions, but it is worth saying, and you mentioned this earlier, right? Well, you said that you can say things on YouTube that you would have been killed 500 years ago.
But change.
You can say things that.
Yeah, I want to say
there's a lag. I've realized there's a lag.
There's a strong history of change. The UK, even the.
Yeah.
To me, sort of the most revealing thing is just how, if you look at the UK had sort of a relative economic decline in the 19th century. If you look at the changes that happened in the second half of the 19th century, there was a spirit of reformism in the UK, which was the hegemon of its time, and that Churchill later became Churchill, David Lloyd George, they abolished. They sort of not abolished. They defanged the House of Lords. I mean, just that was a monumental change in sort of enabling progress, just removing the power of the House of Lords, which would always veto any. It's like our Senate in the United States. And part of the impediment to progress in the United States is that a state with 200,000, 500,000 people gets 2 senators, the same amount as California, which is the size of a large country. And so, that type of change was able to occur in in the UK. And again, progress does not happen in isolation in any country. I think that this sort of this backlash against austerity has occurred simultaneously in the UK and the US together. So, while the NHS is being gutted in the UK, we have sort of a greater privatization of healthcare going on in the US. And so I think that there's a good reason to believe that any sea change in thinking will also happen in the US at the same time.
They're abolishing hereditary lords actually now, aren't they? They're continuing the fight on that front. So I guess there's, even under Keir Starmer's very bland form of governance, there's room for some optimism. And I mean, it is like the way we speak about economics and like conversations like this, that's changed really noticeably. I mean, I think I mentioned industrial policy earlier, and you've got your critiques of it as a purely domestic policy, but it is interesting how with someone like Mariana Mazzucato, for instance, that whole conversation changed. I think modern monetary theory really changed the conversation over deficits and stimulus and austerity. Right, there's been even something like Kate Raworth's donut economics, right, which is actually really popular in the Netherlands. Funnily enough, that sort of changed the conversation. And I do think, maybe it's easy to underestimate. I think it's frustrating because change, even what is probably quite rapid social change, is often slower than we think it is. If you're living through it, you might not really notice it as much, right? You won't view it in the same way as a historian might do. But like it does happen, and it probably has been happening. Well, no, not probably. Since the 2008 financial crisis, I think a lot of old orthodoxies have kind of been demolished, including whatever form of mainstream economics was dominant at the time, right? So we are seeing things move forward, and I guess it's not always reflected in policy and like proper institutional changes, but it is sometimes, and also hopefully over the medium term we'll see it sort of ossified into institutions.
Yeah, and as an American, I think to the last line of question you had, I can say, well, what are you complaining about? Because, you still have insurance. You lose insurance as an American here. You lose your job here as an American. You don't have insurance anymore. So at minimum, there's a lot that, as a UK citizen, despite sort of, and I think there's important to look at what the media is sort of, because the media has an agenda, right? Blogging the UK, well, UK is a third world country now because they have a Labour Party and they have an NHS, and this is where it's gotten us. Yeah. Well, in the US, the life expectancy is lower, and you might find yourself without any healthcare. So.
Yeah. You mentioned that earlier. Actually, it was interesting because I did kind of want to circle back to this, hashtag decline, because I mean, one thing, I'm a bit of an optimist about the USA's domestic economy, and possibly even their social insurance system going forward. Now, obviously, that depends on the outcome of the November election, right? But in terms of, life expectancy declines, were those in the last 4 years, or when was this data from? I mean, how has this changed? Because the US economy is growing very fast, and there are some positive social reforms that, and I don't want to stan Kamala Harris too much, but I do think she seems to be gesturing that she would continue those. So hopefully you don't lose your insurance if you lose your job.
No, there have been groups that have actually improved, like Black women, Latino women have their life expectancy has improved dramatically over time. Even non-white males, their life expectancy has improved over time. But it's not just a COVID phenomenon, because if you remember the Angus Deaton book, where they talk about depths of despair, and I also think it's a relative. It's lower than the UK, and given the relative financial influence that it's not just lower than the UK, it's I think a big portion of Europe. So it, even though it may not be declining life expectancy, the fact that U.S. life expectancy is well behind across income percentiles, is well behind the rest of the developed world. This is stark from the perspective. Is startling from the perspective of an American.
Is that to do with inequality then? Because that would be like the sort of spirit level argument is that the US has higher inequality than, I don't even know if the US does have higher inequality than the UK though, so I don't know if that checks out.
Well, so even the wealthy,
issues,
even the wealthy in the US have a lower life expectancy than the equivalent wealth brackets in the UK. So that was sort of eye opening, and I'm sure. I don't know what the explanation is. I think it was who's the FT's data guy, Murdoch. I think he sort of posted. He posts these charts, and I don't know if the explanation is car accidents and gun fatalities or what is it? Why are the wealthy in the U.S. have a lower life expectancy? But the fact still stands. It's that it's there.
Yeah, no.
In terms of the U.S. economy,
I do want to
make one distinction in terms of the broader U.S. economy, and this goes back to the notion of capital. I don't think enough this myth still perpetuates that the U.S. is doing well because its stock market is doing well. If you look at labor indicators, quits rate, softer labor indicators or indirect labor indicators, the quits rate or hours worked, they're back to pre-COVID levels, sort of when there was a great malaise going about. So there's a large divergence between stock market wealth in the U.S. and sort of the labor market. That's not to say that wages for the lower end haven't gone up. They have over the last 5 years, especially. They've the lower income brackets have sort of their wages have greatly improved, but so have costs. If you look at the higher inflation categories in the U.S., they're occurring in those items that are that lower income brackets tend to purchase more.
Yeah, it's interesting because the USA obviously has a much higher GDP per capita than a lot of, almost everywhere in Europe, except maybe like Luxembourg or whatever. But it also has quite high disposable median income. I mean, I've seen the data. But I think it is interesting that life expectancy is lower because, I mean, we all sort of pay homage to the fact that money isn't everything and money can't buy you happiness and so on. But I think one thing that strikes me is that although the USA does have much higher levels of income, it does seem that it's more marketized than other economies. And what strikes me is maybe people in the US are, for instance, in the USA, you guys seem much more likely to go to a laundrette, for instance, like whereas in most European homes, there's probably a washing machine. In the USA, there seems to be more cars, right? Obviously, health insurance is marketized, whereas it's not here. And there's all these factors. And I just wonder if you look at even if you look at median disposable income or something like that, that's not, driven out by inequality, I wonder if that misses it, because people often make these comparisons about how much richer the US is, but then the social outcomes are not necessarily better, and in fact maybe worse, like life expectancy. So I wonder if that has something to do with it, and that's how you can see the decline more clearly that you're getting at. Because what you're saying is the USA is declining, right, even though maybe its economy is doing quite well. I mean, that's how I read parts of your book anyway.
It certainly fits, right, stagnating, I think. Right now we have what people call a white collar. It's. I'm not too familiar with this term they use. I think with Ingrid Quang-Raven's Brazilianization. This was the first time I heard that term actually, but it seems quite close to the term precarity. And what you have is, in terms of employment, in terms of day-to-day living, there is an increased precarity that has occurred. And 10%, I think, of the U.S. labor force works for private equity-owned enterprise, and that in itself, actually, and believe it or not, it's actually 6.5% for the UK, which is a startlingly high figure, uncomfortably high figure as well. Last I checked,
very high.
And those jobs are there. You can be easily fired from those jobs. I mean, the imprimatur, the mandate of private equity is to just cut, maximize profits without any long, just enough to flip your holdings onto the market. So yeah, quite a bit of day to day, more and more, and this is a sort of a theme I talked about that has repeated itself. More and more of day-to-day life has come under market organization in the modern U.S. And that has that is synonymous with precarity.
Yeah, there's that economist. Do you know the blog Marginal Revolution? It's run by Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok, two economists at George Mason University.
Yeah.
They're quite libertarian. They're a bit heterodox libertarian, but yeah, they're pretty libertarian. But he does markets in everything, doesn't he? He does this regular series, Markets and Everything, where he looks at like new ways the market is being used. And the one I remember most recently is to pay to be working from home in a meeting with other people who are also working. So you're actually paying to work harder, right, at your job, just because you're not at the office. So you need to be like around people virtually. So there was a service that did that. And I just remember thinking, bloody hell, that is like pure marketization. That's incredible.
There's actually one thing I wanted to mention that I remember as an important aspect of what you talked about when you were asking me about institutional change and reform of multilateral institutions. Sorry I think I just want to mention it because it's also relevant to immigration. So let me give you two stark examples. Let's compare Japan and Egypt. Egypt has had persistent balance of payments, currency woes throughout its modern history. Japan has been known for having one of the most stable currencies in modern history. I mean, the Japanese yen is also a safe haven currency. When risk off happens or panic happens in markets, people flee to the yen. And it's sort of this idea of we talk about intra-country distribution, but part of what also plagues the sort of global economy is inter-country inequality. So, Japan is this country of in population decline that has a disproportionate amount of wealth for its population. And this is another imbalance that, if there is to be any correction of global inequity, have to fix itself. And I think one of the European countries, I forget if it was Germany, was sort of filed a complaint that Japan wasn't accepting enough immigrants, which sort of makes sense. Historically, they've been very hostile, inward-looking and hostile to foreign cultures historically. A few times I've been to Japan, quite liked it, but that sort of is a sort of unfairness that persists. How does something like that get rectified? I think that will have to be a big part of institutional change as well.
Yeah. The immigration, like sort of international immigration controls and management, but presumably with an entirely different ethos to what immigration control currently means. Well, it's certainly in my country and in the US as well, I guess, right? Which is just like fewer immigrants, right? But like actual management of how people move around, right? Done in a sort of democratic and equal way.
That's right. Well, it's if it's sort of becoming unjustifiable that a country with population decline is able to hold this considerable sum of development or wealth, where while these countries with burgeoning populations just not struggle to even break out of basic development. And the only answer you get for that is sort of prejudiced views of, they shouldn't be having too many kids. A sort of refrain that has been echoed across history. If they have a large population, it's because they're ignorant and don't know how to control themselves. It was just ridiculous. And especially with climate crises, I think, in the climate, certain parts of the world just become uninhabitable. So sort of countries like Japan needing to accept more immigrants will have to also be part of whatever multilateral reform occurs.
I mean, the other side of that, right, is you've got the, more accepting of immigrants, but with the wealth inequality, right? I mean, you kind of hint at this, or maybe you don't hint at it, maybe you just say it, but international ways of redistributing wealth, ways of making sure that everyone's needs across the globe are met. And it's something that I've been pushing for a long time. And I feel like even since I started my YouTube channel, I sort of, it's becoming my thing. In the pandemic, I was struck by the essential workers thing, where everybody was like, oh, these are the essential workers, bus drivers, people who prepare and deliver food, nurses, obviously, and doctors, and maybe teachers in some cases. But it wasn't it wasn't up for debate. It was just really obvious to everybody. I think everyone was like, oh yeah, they're the essential workers. We've just been pretending that like hedge fund managers and people who work in marketing and academics, let's be fair, and YouTubers as well, are actually important. But actually, we know who the essential workers are. And yet, essential workers are not particularly well remunerated, right? I mean, even within rich countries, let alone essential work across the globe. And for me, I just think a big thing is properly treating these workers properly, and that includes unpaid work as well, which is disproportionately done by women. But like that seems to chime with your message, right?
Well, in New York City, for instance, a lot of the restaurants construction, there's a lot of new migrants from Venezuela, El Salvador, Ecuador involved, and they've been undercovered. But what strikes me as especially perverse is that they're here for a reason. And that reason is that their economies have been intertwined in Anglo-American global financial systems for 200 years. When I first started my career, one of the first countries I had to look at was Venezuela. And this was right after Hugo Chavez died. And Venezuela is a profligate spender because there is something inherently wrong with them. They don't have the right character, or they don't, they're bad actors. And it totally ignores the history of Venezuela in relation to the U.S. Venezuela, starting in 1900, was a big, was important sort of oil asset for American multinational oil companies. And you just can't paper over that history and the economic path dependence that arises from that, and why that it isn't just that the Chavista government is socialist and wants to spend left and right and doesn't understand economics. It's that there's this trauma and legacy of malfeasance from the United States and Western Europe, and sort of the debt shackles that they've imposed on this country for over a century now. And so these workers that have come to these U.S., you cannot separate their migration to their presence here from that history.
There are two aspects to it, right? There's do you allow them to come if they want and have a more a fairer international immigration system that recognizes this, but also how you transform the economy and transform these countries as well to make it so that fewer people do need to go to the USA to make a living, right? And I guess that goes to this idea of like international redistribution, reorienting international institutions, right, and making sure that there's provision for the population within these countries. Basically, the opposite of what Javier Milei is doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. I mean, I think we've pretty much covered everything. We've solved the global economy anyway. We know what to do now. I mean, is there any big aspect of the book that we've missed out, or is there anything that's happened since that we haven't covered? Because it was 3 years ago, right? It came out 3 years ago. You probably wrote it 4 years ago. What's changed? How do you look back on the book?
Again, to have an optimistic spin, the response to the pandemic stimulus that was meaningful. You cannot just. I don't think you can just paper over the fact that sort of ignore actually the contrast to the stimulus response to the pandemic in comparison to the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, in the 2008 financial crisis, you had you had Larry Summers and his friends in Washington trying to limit the size of the stimulus, and I think they learned their lesson when it came to the pandemic, and made sure not to make that same mistake. But I think I did not foresee. It wasn't really. I don't know how relevant it's to the topic of the book, but I didn't foresee just the sheer. I think this is sort of ignored. Is just the sheer size of the stock market appreciation that has occurred in the U.S. And when you consider there's a sizable portion of Americans that own index funds, have money tied in housing and stock market wealth that sort of have spent according to this wealth effect. That has really struck me as something I did not foresee. And going forward, I don't think there's sort of this complacency that the stock market in the U.S. will keep going up. That ignores that. It's kind of hard for the Nasdaq, especially, has gone up like 4 or 5 times, something that matches the Japanese stock market bubble of the 90s. It's like we're talking about something that is in the textbook of historical bubbles. And when that asset price wealth spigot is no longer there, what happens? What happens when you had these startlingly high interest rate hikes that honestly, in my opinion, had no effect in bringing down inflation in the U.S. I think inflation in the U.S. would have come down anyways. And there's a decent amount of people saying that the recent disinflation in the U.S. has had little to do with the Fed's price hikes. What the big mystery is what is the end effect of these Fed hikes? What is it going to mean, not just for the U.S. but for the global economy? That I think. I think that remains to be seen, in my opinion, because none of these in these other in the Dutch Republic and in British Empire, asset wealth was more narrowly concentrated than in the U.S. And there's a decent amount there are far more people in the U.S. now that tie their mental well-being, unfortunately, to the performance of the stock market. And if you have a Harris administration that comes in that the media portrays as unfriendly to the stock market, that the media starts blaming poor stock market performance. If you just look at the standpoint of just sort of stagnating stock market on what is the outcome of that, I don't know. That's a big mystery to me. And the last thing I'll say related to the book itself is I didn't intend to want to make a profit out of this book. If you find my book through some means online, feel free to acquire it. Feel free to acquire my book outside of Amazon or other The usual means is the best way I can put it. And if you
in a
ask me a copy, if you want a
way.
copy, yeah, in a non-marketized way, and please send me your feedback, and I'd be more than happy to. I try to not keep a social media presence though, so it might have a harder time finding me. But yeah, I'd love to hear feedback and from more people.
I was about to say that it took me about 3 years to find you, so I was wondering where people can give you feedback. But
I just can't do social media anymore. It's just
it
really it's ideology. Yeah,
I mean,
but but please, feel free to acquire my book as whatever which way you like.
Yeah. No, I'd really recommend it, and we've discussed parts of it, but I think there's such a long history in the book of like the Dutch and British and American stories that maybe takes up almost half of the book together. I think all of them. That's just really, really detailed and interesting, and it's quite a fresh perspective, especially because I don't think you hear that much about the Netherlands usually. You don't hear about that story and the parallels with interest rates and the dominance of their financial sector and their military and being on the technological frontier as well. So I would really recommend it to everybody. I think it's quite a refreshing perspective.
Thank you again.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. I'm gonna end the stream now.